Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this, our very last session on our three-day conference. My name is John Cornell, and I am with the Pilecki-Institut. And I have very distinguished panelists with me for a final discussion session. With me, to my left, is Professor Magdalena Gawin, who, as we know already, is director of the Pilecki-Institut, former Undersecretary of State in the Polish Ministry of Culture, and the General Conservator of Monuments for Poland. She is a noted historian, habilitated doctor, and longtime member of the Institute of History at the Polish Academy of Sciences. We also have with us Professor Mark Kramer, who is the Director of Cold War Studies at Harvard University and of Harvard's Sakharov Program on Human Rights, and a Senior Fellow of Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. We also have Ralf Fücks, who is Managing Director of the Centrum Liberale Moderne in Berlin and one of our co-sponsor here, who was formerly president of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, the political foundation associated with the German Green Party, and was co-chair of the Green Party from 1989 to 1990. Also with us is Professor Kseniya Yurtayeva, who is an associate professor in the Department of Criminal Law and Criminology at Kharkiv National University of Internal Affairs, and is currently a visiting scholar at the Weiser Diplomacy Center in the Gerald Ford School of Public Administration at the University of Michigan. And finally, we have with us Iain Dale, who is one of Britain's leading political commentators and bloggers. He is the presenter of LBC Radio's evening show, a visiting professor of politics and broadcasting at the University of East Anglia, and an award-winning podcaster. Before we begin the session, we have a brief clip to be shown, which is a summary of the conference so far. So I invite you to watch, and as a kind of a recapitulation of things that we have been discussing over the past 3 days. Thank you. I'd just like to say, you have all been thanking us as the organizers of this conference, but I extend a great thanks to all of you for coming, for joining us, for being here, for participating in this. It has been a great honor for us and a great pleasure to have you all here. So thank you all. So I would like to conduct this by asking a few very kind of simplistic questions to each of our panelists. The title of this session is The War in Ukraine and Its Influence on Europe. I think that maybe a little narrow. I would say that perhaps we can speak just more generally about changes that are being brought about in Europe and in the world at large by this conflict, or changes that were already happening but are simply being made more apparent by the war. Just as a way of kind of summarizing what we have been discussing over the past few days. And as I ask questions, I hope that you will feel free to ignore my questions if you have more important things to say, honestly. It really is just would like you to kind of say what you think ought to be said at this point, what hasn't been said in the past 3 days and what needs to be said. So first of all, I would ask you, Magdalena, we've just talked this morning about westplaning, and Patrick Labuda mentioned this too in his talk yesterday in the context of post-colonial theory. And I wonder if perhaps the war will in any way reshape this odd construction of an East or East Central Europe versus a West Europe. And could it be the case, and this may sound either optimistic or naive, that as Russia becomes more isolated from Europe and more clearly a security threat, whether Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, Bulgaria, and all of what we could call East Central or Central Europe, will be drawn closer, both in geopolitics and also in the imagination in the Western Europe of this part of the world.
Thank you very much. I absolutely agree. I mean that from the beginning, I repeat that Russian aggression against Ukraine is not an episode of history, is a turning point in the history of 21st century. So the war absolutely changed our present, but also assessment of our past and our future. And I think that the impact of the war, in spite of the tragedy of millions of Ukrainians who suffer as a consequence of the war, I think that Western Europe, some Europeans find out where is Kiev, where is the main Ukrainian cities. They know much more about Ukraine, about the history of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And what is important, the most important thing for us, the most important challenges for international community to help Ukraine win the war and to help Ukraine to win the peace. This is the two main aims. The first one requires from all of us, from all European countries, is to help to supply Ukraine military weapons, humanitarian aid. The second one, concerning the good program of recovery of Ukraine after the war. And maybe I just developed the second question. I asked Professor Hrycak, who I hope is with us still, about challenges after the Ukraine wins the war with Russia. What is the most important for Ukraine? In my opinion, I am historian, has a tendency to undermine question of state and local administration. Just like we don't feel that we breathing and we need an air, and the state administration and local administration is like an air. So to make absolutely efficient administration in Ukraine, and now Ukraine is on very good way, because we see some kind of reforms and trends very, very positive. It's like one pillar. The second pillar is absolutely fight against corruption, because corruption is like a cancer. Corruption destroys every state. And Poland also tackled with the corruption after the fall of communism during the 90s. I remember very well the hot discussion in Poland about corruption. Some of our politicians denied that the corruption is a problem. But from one turning point, all politicians agree, corruption is a cancer. So the two main challenges is before the Ukraine And I think that I'm absolutely sure that Ukraine will win the war and will build a better state, better society, more reunified. So I think that in spite of the level of unhappiness and sufferings of millions of Ukrainians, I'm absolutely sure that the conflict between Ukraine and Russia will end in a good way. And so, maybe one note about the international law. And as I said at the first day of the conference about the need to break the chain of aggressive war of Russia that presented, for example, Mr. Professor, and the impunity. Aggression, impunity, aggression, impunity, aggression, impunity. I think that I know that the international law is very sophisticated. I'm absolutely sure that it's very difficult to change it. All of we now, even from the speeches of our panelists, know how difficult it is to reform the international law. But the most important is the political will. Political will. And I strongly believe that if the aggression against Ukraine is a turning point in history of Europe, this time, Putin and political leaders, Russian leaders, must be punished. And this is the huge challenge before lawyers, before politicians, political commentators, just to think about it. And because of that, sometimes lawyers think about international law as something very, very stable, and I would say that with a statement that is impossible to change anything. I would like to remind all of us that when Lemkin introduced the World Genocide and the Convention, he was almost completely alone, because most of the lawyers were strongly opposed. But I think that it's worth to continue to rethink the final effect of the terrible, cruel aggression, Russian aggression, and to achieve some kind of plan what we should to do to punish the political elite of Russia. So I think that if we don't do it, all dictators elsewhere will draw the lesson that the West has lost its will to defend its friends, allies, and itself. This is a very important sign for the future. And it's not only a relationship between Russia and Ukraine, because we are thinking about just about the world, about international relationship, and it's very, very important. And I think that we should pursue to punish political leaders who are dependent, who are responsible for the aggression. Also, not lost everything what was won as a final effect of the Cold War in 1991. Because Putin wants to restore the Soviet sphere of influence, and its aim that the war against Ukraine is not the war between two states. It's our responsibility, it's our history. So my general conclusion is that we have a wonderful 3 days of conference, and frankly speaking, I'm surprised that so many people come to us to listen us, and historians, journalists, political commentators, and this is a very good sign, because I have impression that we touched very important point, and I think that we should continue our meetings in Berlin and in Warsaw to discuss, to exchange opinion, to rethink what happened and what will happen in Europe. Thank you.
Okay, I will pick up also in dealing with what John raised. Let me just say, though, that I want to touch on a few points that have come up at the conference. One of them is the question of accountability for breaches of the Geneva Conventions and other laws of war. Is clearly in this war, the overwhelming share of breaches have been perpetrated by Russian forces. You know, if you were to tally it up, it'd probably be 95% or more. However, it is extremely important for Ukrainians in the Ukrainian government also to want to conform to those Geneva Conventions. That is, it will not only strengthen the credibility of criticism of Russia's own breaches, but it will also strengthen the country in the sense that you want to live in a country, that is you meaning, that's the generic you, but for Ukrainians want to live in a country that is democratic and that conforms to the norms of a democratic, open society. And that will be enhanced by complying with those conventions. And therefore, when I see videos of Russian POWs being mistreated, it worries me because it is a breach of those norms, and I hope will either be punished or certainly put to an end. It is not something in any way to take pride in. There was one of those videos shown here 2 days ago. So let me just emphasize that in holding Russia accountable, you want to ensure that Ukraine itself lives up to very high standards, as it can and for the most part has. The second thing would be, in terms of holding Russian war criminals and just in general Russia accountable for this war, the war of aggression, there are very significant practical obstacles to that. So in thinking about this came up in the final session yesterday. I don't think these can just be dismissed. It does require, if you want to imagine something as Patrick Labuda's recommendation was, even though I don't think imagining alone is going to take you very far, I do think you have to think about some of the practical means. There is no way currently to work through the UN Security Council because of Russia's holding of the permanent seat there and its veto as a result. So I think that there is one instance in which the permanent seats on the UN Security Council were changed, which came in 1971 when the People's Republic of China replaced Taiwan on the council. If you look back at what happened during that period, how that change came about, there was an effort, unfortunately unsuccessful effort, by the United States and other Western countries, primarily Britain, to keep Taiwan represented in the United Nations. The Chinese communists fought that ferociously. And ultimately, when this change was brought about through the UN General Assembly, it left Taiwan out in the cold. That is, that Taiwan was no longer entitled to representation. Although it's, again, at that time, Taiwan was a dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek, who wanted Taiwan to continue to be the Republic of China, that is, representing the whole of China. So it's not even clear how the government on Taiwan would have responded. Nonetheless, it would have been much better if the resolutions, repeated resolutions introduced by the United States in the UN General Assembly had been successful, and Taiwan would still be there, because now it is a extremely prosperous, democratic, and thriving democracy. It really sets an example, I think, for other countries that were once dictatorships. So in thinking about whether it is feasible to approach this issue through the UN General Assembly, the votes aren't there right now, but potentially they could be, that to either remove Russia or curtail its seat on a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And that's, if I were thinking about ways of approaching this issue, that's the way I would probably try to go. A couple of other quick things. I do want to respond to the issue that came up here a short while ago in the previous session. Someone referred to Russians as being infantilized and of never protesting. Historically, that's just not true. In March 1917, for example, in Petrograd, there were huge crowds of Russians that brought about the overthrow of the Tsar, which was an extremely positive change. Unfortunately, it was tragically undone by what happened in November 1917. But then in January 1991, it wasn't just August 1991, there were much more significant demonstrations on the streets of Moscow in response to the crackdown in Lithuania and then Latvia in January 1991. 350,000 Russians went out onto the streets, not to protest what was going on there. They were protesting the crackdown in the Baltic states. They wanted democratic change. In February and March of 1991, likewise, there were hundreds of thousands of Russians on the streets of Moscow. So I wouldn't be dismissive of this. I think instead it's a way of thinking about how to rekindle it. There were mass demonstrations in Russia, not just in Moscow, but in several dozen cities in December 2011. But they were not on the scale of these earlier ones. So I think in trying also to deal with the future of Russia, because Russia's always going to be a neighbor of Ukraine, that you really do try to have some way of thinking about how to rekindle that spirit of defiance in Russia, even though it may be a tall order, given the way Putin has reasserted such draconian state repression. So that brings me to the final thing I want to mention, which is that yesterday Dame Plash raised the question of whether Russia will hold together, especially if this war results in a defeat. And again, that is certainly a very good thing to think about. There was a conference at Brown University in 1993 that led to a volume ultimately. And at that conference, the question was discussed about whether Russia would hold together. There was one participant, and I was that participant, who thought Russia would hold together. Other participants thought it would not, and that would be undesirable. I thought it would hold together, and that would be undesirable. I was the only one there who thought that Russia would hold together, but that it should disintegrate. I still would hold to that today. I think Russia as 6 regions would have been a much easier neighbor to live with. So the key question in thinking about the future of Russian-Ukrainian relations, I think, which is going to be a major challenge for Ukraine indefinitely, is there was a very clever article published about, I don't know, close to 20 years ago, called War is a Commitment Problem. And that means that wars will very likely recur unless you can have faith that the parties who settle a war will abide by the commitments they adopt. And the Russian government under Putin has shown repeatedly that it attaches no value to the commitments that it supposedly has embraced. So in thinking about both how to hold Russian leaders accountable, and also how to avoid a new war, even if this war ends with a complete Ukrainian victory. You could foresee a resumption of the war in the future. So that the question is not only how to hold Russia accountable, but how to ensure a settlement or some arrangement that will ensure that Russia lives by its commitments. And that, to me, means NATO membership for Ukraine.
Thanks a lot, David. I would like to refer to both of my previous speakers. First on Magdalena, when you were talking about reconstruction and supporting institution building in Ukraine after the war, I observed that I was a little bit uncomfortable with it. Although we, at the Center of Liberal Modernity, we are already engaged in some projects, especially how to reconstruct the energy sector in Ukraine and how to connect current emergency aid with some long-term reconstruction, making the energy system more resilient, more efficient, and more sustainable. But I think we should not be too sure that Ukraine will win the war, to say it bluntly. I think, and I'm not at all defeatistic. Yeah, I'm convinced that Ukraine can win the war. It must win the war. But when I listening to voices in Germany, especially after the successful Ukrainian offensive in autumn, I think we should not underestimate the determination of the Russian regime to fight until the end. And they will start a new offensive maybe in some weeks ago. They don't hesitate to sacrifice 10,000s and 10,000s of soldiers, cannon fodder. They will continue, or at least they will try to continue, destroy the Ukrainian infrastructure and to wage a kind of war of attrition, calculating that finally Ukraine will not be able to hold on, and that the West will get tired in its support of Ukraine. So it's very much about us. It's very much about the West, very much about Europe, and also about Germany, if Ukraine will be able to win this war. It depends on our ongoing military support, financial support, not only humanitarian aid, financial support. Ukraine needs every month around about $3 billion of financial aid to run the state and to reconstruct the infrastructure which the civil life of Ukraine is depending from. And I'm a little bit worried that as far as I get it and as we get it in our institute, and a lot of friends and colleagues in the German support movement for Ukraine, that not only the German government, but a lot of Western governments up to now did not make up their mind about the endgame of this war. Which kind of outcome do we achieve? And if you're listening to the language of the German Chancellor, it's still undecided. Ukraine must not lose the war, Russia must not win the war. But never, Russia must be defeated and Ukraine has to win the war. And this is not only a German problem. I think the US has shifted in the last weeks and months to a more determined position to support Ukraine to win the war, but they never declared it openly. And also other, especially Western European governments, France and others. And I think this is an effort we still need to continue to convince our public and to pressure our governments that they get a very clear position regarding the outcome of the war. No arrangement with Russia on the expense of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, on the expense of the full political sovereignty of Ukraine, and of Ukraine's Western integration. Though EU membership and the prospect of NATO membership are key. And this hesitation then in our governments and also in part of our public opinion, we have an ongoing dispute on that, is I think mainly there are two fundamental arguments there. The first one is Ukraine will not be able to win this war militarily. We have an ongoing discussion on that. And the second one is the fear of escalation. Yeah, that if we, quote unquote, push Russia into the corner and bring Putin at the brink of humiliating defeat, they will run crazy. And they will do do some horrible things, be it using nuclear weapons in Ukraine or expanding the war beyond the Ukrainian borders. So, and we have to confront these arguments. Yeah, so it's an ongoing struggle we are in, and it's and this undecidedness in terms of the end game of the war also relates to other topics which are closely connected with the military issue, the legal accountability of the Russian leadership. If you go for as international special tribunal on war of aggression against the Russian leadership, you are slamming the door for any kind of diplomatic arrangements. This is the final breach with the Russian regime. And also the confiscation of the Russian financial assets freezed in the West. This is the third criteria. And they are all three interlinked. So I think we still have to fight and to argue that the West must unite in a strategic determination that first Ukraine, in our own interest, Ukraine must win the war. Russian leadership has to be accountable legally for war of aggression and crimes against humanity, and Russian state's assets must be used for compensation and reconstruction in Ukraine. This is the triangle, the strategic triangle which is still not clear. And final remark on Mark's comment. As far as I understood, Mark, I agree that we should not write off Russia forever. So we are in a constant argument in our own team, but also with our friends and partners from Ukraine and from Russia, those who are in prison or in exile. The one school of thought is forget about Russia. The imperial mindset and the autocratic mindset is so deeply rooted that you will not see kind of democratic change for the next generation. And the other school of thought is, please, there is no kind of genetic defect in Russia, that Russians per se are not able for change to a modern democratic nation. But of course, all depends from the outcome of the war. We cannot spare Russia a defeat in Ukraine, because this is the key. If there's any chance for positive change, it's only after a defeat. And only after kind of shock that this kind of neo-imperial mania has failed, definitely failed in Ukraine. So if we want to see any positive change in Russia in the future, we have to be clear about the end game of the war. Thank you.
Yes, I think I have to reflect on their previous speakers, because I'm the only representative of Ukraine on this panel. So, of course, I would like to say that a lot of that you were saying is true, but Ukraine has already proved that it's a strong state. It doesn't have the possibility to be weak. We are showing that strong on the battlefield. We are showing that strong on the political field, and they are determined to win this war. And I would like, yes, I think it's better now. And we don't have a possibility we don't have a choice not to fight, not to protect our statehood. And I would like to say that today the discussion is about the war in Ukraine, the war like so-called on the Russian-Ukrainian war, but I would say that it's have more implications. It's much wider, and I would say it's more a war of their civilized world, which is committed to the democratic values against the aggressor state, who is disguising the international law and order, and actually it's much wider. So it's not a possibility of their other countries to stay away and be ignorant of what is going on in Ukraine. That's why I would like to also reflect on some things that have been talked about in the previous days, and some of the things that have not been covered during the previous days about the nature of this war. Because of course, as we all were talking during the previous days, that everybody was shocked how their atrocities that we were thinking were left in the history and they would never come again, that they are coming back. But they also, with mass killings, atrocities and rape that are happening in Ukraine, there's also some other methods of warfare that are new to our world, and that probably will be dominant in their future warfare. That's why I would like to say that probably the war in Ukraine that I was talking about in my previous presentation yesterday is the war of the new type. So it's utilized different dimensions of war, and it implicate political, economical, and other ways of supporting the military force attacks in Ukraine. And for example, one of the things that is new to their more or less new to the military attacks is that the shelling is taking part on the whole territory of Ukraine, and it has different meaning. It also have a psychological effect to quell their resistance of the Ukrainian nation. It has economical effects, and also, of course, to defeat the military military forces of Ukraine, but also their bombing of the critical infrastructure of Ukraine deprived the citizens of Ukraine of their vital utilities. And of course, this winter is not that severe in Europe, and it partially saves our population, Ukrainian population, from hypothermia, because people can be. I was really afraid because my family, most part of my family, stayed in Ukraine because they couldn't live for different reasons, and it's a real threat to Ukrainian nation. In their international humanitarian law, we have such crime as implicit using the starvation as a method of warfare. But today maybe we have to talk about their using their bombing of the critical infrastructures that may inflict their deaths to their millions of people without really killing them directly, but it's also can be a new war crime that should be put into their statutes. So, and we were talking today that there should be a political will to change the international law, but maybe it should be the combination of the scientific sort, as I think, and also the political will that will change and make this law to the better conditions, so that we can fight and prosecute the crimes. And another maybe implication of this war that I would also like to address that really wasn't talking about during the whole 3 days of the conference is the cyber aggression against Ukraine. And it's really is taking place right now, and it started not really from the large-scale invasion. It started basically at least in 2013, 2014 with a mass flow of disinformation, but then it transformed to something different that we didn't see before, practically in any other state. It was the attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure. They were attacks in 2015 and 2016 against the Ukrainian power grid, and it was of course before the large-scale invasion, but it deprived millions of Ukrainians from electricity. And we can see that this is a war without barriers that a lot of the countries were relying on. That we were thinking that if we are far away, the enemy won't be able to attack us. But right now it's not true anymore. And we should understand, because for the future conflicts, they won't be in the same way. And we can see it right now in Ukraine. Also, another a cyber attack that was taking place in Ukraine was just in 2017. Remarkably, it was one day before the day of the Ukrainian Constitution, and it was with the use of the virus that is right now well known. It was called non-PETA, but it attacked. It was a distributed supply chain attack and attacked governmental sector. And actually, what was interesting about all this chains of attack that was taking part in Ukraine, place in Ukraine, that they were in their character, they were non-mercenaries, so they didn't really wanted to gain any material gain. So they were attacking public sector. They were specifically attacking Ukrainian governmental sites, and they were actually attributed to their proxies that are associated with the Russian Federation. So we can say the cyber aggression against Ukraine is started at least 8 years ago. And right now, during their large-scale invasion, we can also see their manifestations of this cyber war. And it's also cyber operations, so-called stricto sensu. So they, when their cyberspace is used to attack the targets in the cyberspace, but there is also the combination of the cyber attacks and the kinetic attacks. And this is Ukrainian, the war against Ukraine shows this. We have there, when the first cyber attacks were not successful, for example, in the first hours of their invasion, our Ukrainian units were deprived of the internet and satellite connection because their American company that was providing support of their internet connection through the satellite, they were attacked, and the nature of this attack is not right now publicized, but only after their help with Starlink from Elon Musk, Ukrainian units got back this connection pretty quickly, but it was good that it was such a possibility. After a series, really a series of the massive cyber attacks, that then their combination and cyber and kinetic attacks followed. And our Ukrainian infrastructure, also transport infrastructure and governmental sites, and also our data centers were attacked not only in the cyberspace, but was also physically. And their cybersecurity experts, they said that right now we should not only try to hide and patch our cybersecurity system, we have to kind of think if they are in the reach of their Russian missiles. So it's not only their attacks in the cyberspace, but in combination. And this is what is new about this war and what we are all experiencing right now. And another question is, of course, informational war. So we're probably, it's a very broad question, but I was just wanted to draw your attention that this war against Ukraine, this aggressive war is not limited to the territory of Ukraine, and it has implication even not only on Europe, but also worldwide. That's why we have to resist consistently and together.
I would say I agree with virtually every word that Ralf said. So it's bald men of the world unite, I think, on this one. I think that one of the major things that we have to do now, which this conference has done, is to look forward and look at different scenarios and try and work out, well, okay, if Ukraine wins outright, what happens then? If Russia wins, what happens then? And you've done that in this conference, certainly on the war crimes front. But of course, it's a lot wider than that. But I want to look back a little bit first and go back to September, October last year, when it was quite clear to some of us that Putin was intent on invading Ukraine. But the defense establishment, the foreign policy establishment throughout Europe, was very keen to say, oh, no, that won't happen. Putin wouldn't do that. He wouldn't be so stupid. And as the build-up of soldiers on the Ukrainian border started and built up, and then field hospitals were built, and I kept interviewing so-called defense experts and saying, well, why would he do that if he didn't intend to use them? You don't build field hospitals in trials. And right up to the 24th of February, most of these people were absolutely adamant that it wasn't going to happen. And I think they need to be held accountable for that because they are supposed to be experts and they clearly didn't know what they were talking about. And then you had on the journalistic side, Putin's favorite journalists, one of whom in London, a very experienced journalist who was on my radio show in the days leading up to the invasion, basically putting the Putin line. And to her credit, 2 days after the invasion, she came on again. I mean, she actually came into the studio and faced the music and admitted that she'd been wrong on everything to do with Putin over the last 10 or 15 years, which took some courage. But I think over the course of the next few years, these people need to be called out for their errors. One of the reasons I think that Ukraine has attracted almost universal support, certainly throughout Europe, possibly less so in other parts of the world, is the PR campaign that the Ukrainian government have launched. Sort of, you don't win wars just on the battlefield, you win them through hearts and minds as well. And I think the fact that Ukrainian members of parliament, generally young female members of parliament, have been sent out to Britain, to Germany, to France especially, to put the case very eloquently to the peoples of those countries has been absolutely crucial in ensuring political support from those countries. And I will always remember the day that I had 3 female Ukrainian MPs in the studio for an hour taking calls from my listeners, and during one of the breaks, the Conservative MP who had got them all together, she got a text from our Defence Minister, Ben Wallace, telling her that he had approved a new missile defence system to be sent to Ukraine. And she read this out to these 3 MPs, and one of them literally, sorry, I always get emotional when I say this, got up and danced around the studio. You don't see that very often in a radio studio. And when you have people like Alexei Goncharenko, who is the Member of Parliament for Odessa, sort of right at the heart of the conflict, telling you that his wife and children are back in Odessa fearing for their lives, that has a real effect on people. So getting the support of the British public, the German public, the French public, and all through Europe has been absolutely crucial. And I think when this started, I wondered how unified the Western response would be, through NATO or through the EU. And I think with 1 or 2 sort of exceptions at various points along the way, it has been absolutely inspiring to see the unity that there has been. And apart from 1 or 2 idiots like the former Belgian Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt, who earlier this week on my radio station blamed Brexit for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, you can blame Brexit for a lot of things, but I don't think that really works. So then Nigel Farage, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, he blames the EU for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you're thinking, well, the invasion of Crimea happened in 2014, before Brexit was even done. And you think, how do these people's brains work? So they have to be called out for the idiocy that they promote. I think one of the big problems that is now facing Western Europe in particular is the supply of arms, because basically there isn't a lot left. I mean, if you look at the ammunition supplies from different countries, they're virtually empty. And you think, well, why aren't the arms manufacturers manufacturing sort of new things? And I think that in a few months' time is going to be the big subject of debate. Well, where are the arms going to come from that we can buy to supply to Ukraine? That, I think, is a major worry. And I think Ralf is absolutely right not to assume, and I hate saying this, and I'm sure you did too, but we cannot assume that Ukraine will prevail. I hope to God they do, because, I mean, this is a turning point in history. We can all identify different turning points, but this is one of them. And if Putin prevails, the international order throughout the world is going to be affected. And again, this is an area of discussion which I don't think really we've gone into enough. We're concentrating on the here and now rather than looking at what the situation might be in 6 to 12 months' time. I hope the West stays united. I think it will. I mean, it does come to something, though. I have to say this, when the German Greens are more hardline on this than the German SPD. I mean, I think that is a bizarre state of affairs. But, I mean, Germany has stepped up to the mark in a way that I think sometimes in my country we don't acknowledge enough. But the rhetoric sometimes here, I think, has surpassed the reality, surpassed the action that is then taken immediately. You get there in the end, but it takes a little bit too long. And that's all I really want to say at the moment.
Thank you for that, Iain. Perhaps somebody would like to just simply continue the conversation. Magda.
Thank you. Is it good? Okay. Thank you very much. And I think that before Germany is a very great challenge to change their attitudes towards the Middle Eastern Europe, and to change the Ostpolitics, which was continued from the 70s. And as a consequence of that, Nord Stream first, Nord Stream the second, very deep cultural cooperation on the level of economy, brought this effect that we have now. And I can't agree with Ralf Fücks because with your statement that we don't know how the war could end it, because everything depends on us. It's our responsibility, our. If we are talking about, yes, but the war reveals also the division in Europe into Anglo-Saxon world, plus Poland and Middle Eastern Europe. This is the great comeback also Great Britain in spite of the Brexit. And some hesitate state like Germany and France. So we have a unity, but we have also the degree of support for Ukraine. And I think that I don't buy this argument that people scare in Germany the escalation of the war, because I would like to remind all of you that all of we witnessed what happened in Bucha, in Mariupol. We observed the atrocity beyond imagination, rapes and killings, murdering people. And what would happen if Ukraine would have surrendered? This is the question. What would happen? Because as we see, this is not a war, military war, but in a large scale, this is the Russian war against Ukraine nation, against civilians. To stable bombing of city, of civilians, have no any military aim. So I think that it is a very difficult decision, but I hope that all European countries and Anglo-Saxon countries, including United States of America, will do everything to help Ukraine. I'm also very, very proud that Poland was the first country in Europe who completely supports Ukraine, as the first country, who repeated that Ukraine must win, and because of that, because of our belief, very deep belief, we had provided for Ukraine military weapons, around 300 tanks and heavy ammunition. Now we continue discussion about F-16. And just, I would like to, how to say, to build the solidarity around the Ukraine, because it's the most important thing. If European values are important, if it's not the empty slogan, so Ukraine must win. In 1939, Poland was attacked by two sides, from Soviet Union and from Germany. And we believed that we should win. Of course, for Poland, the story ended tragically, but once again, in 1980, my country created, in spite of terrible communism, solidarity, 10 million people, and because of that, the Berlin Wall fell apart. So European values is for everybody, but it's also duties. It's not only privilege, it's also our duties. We have to be with Ukraine and do everything to help Ukraine.
Can I just say on Poland, I think, sorry. I think the Polish role in all of this has been completely underestimated in the rest of Europe. We all talk about sort of Britain, Germany and France, but actually Poland has been the most crucial country here. And I broadcast my radio show last night from Berlin, and Lukasz Adamski, I don't know if he's here, was on the show. And one of my callers phoned in, a British person, a British Pole, Marek from Enfield. He phoned in and he put forward all the things that Poland had done. And I thought to myself while he was speaking, I bet 95% of my listeners have no idea what Poland has done, because it's all about Germany and what Germany hasn't done, or Macron trying to appease Putin. That's all we hear about. So the media have a real place here to try and explain what happens in other countries and all of the other neighbouring Eastern European countries, because they have a very different perspective from those sort of a little further away. And just one other point, we talk about, well, what does the future hold? And often on a radio phone-in, you get people saying, well, we've got to move towards peace. We've got to have talks. And I'm thinking, well, who is we here? I mean, how can we in Britain or in the EU decide when Ukraine decides that it should sit down with Russia and talk? To me, Zelensky is the only person that is qualified to make that decision, and he may well make that decision at some point. I have no idea. But it's people, I think, who may have the best of intentions, but they will say, well, but there's got to be a peace deal. And then as soon as you say, well, what does that look like, the argument falls to pieces because no one has any idea.
Very quickly on the question of supplies of weaponry, the United States does have weapons, a good number of weapons it can supply. And
no need to brag.
Let me just mention 3 categories of weapons. One would be air defense. There are extremely advanced air defense systems the United States that has not yet supplied. There are also large numbers of combat aircraft, both fighters and bombers. Bombers will be controversial, but I still think that it would be appropriate to supply them, at least for ground support operations to bomb Russian ground forces. The third category would be longer range missiles, both cruise missiles in particular, but also ballistic missiles. Those would help even the disproportionate number of attacks that Russia is able to carry out with long-range missiles, and it wouldn't prevent them. That really would require much greater air defense supplies, but it would certainly perhaps be a deterrent. The other thing I should add, historically, the Soviet Union and China in the early and mid-1970s, knew that if they continued supplying weapons to the North Vietnamese, the Vietnamese communists, that the United States was going to leave Vietnam. And so the Nixon administration was under the illusion that through détente it could encourage the Soviet Union to push the North Vietnamese to negotiate. And the Chinese never considered that, quite the contrary, that they encouraged the Vietnamese communists to win on the battlefield. There were a few feeble attempts by the Soviet Union, but for the most part, Brezhnev in closed sessions of the Communist Party would boast about how much weaponry the Soviet Union was providing, and that this was designed to ensure the complete victory of the Vietnamese communists, which is exactly what happened in 1975. There was a humiliating U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, and that's what I think the West should be aspiring to here. I'm not yet convinced, just as Ralf isn't, that Western countries are committed to that. I should add that with regard to the United States, I think the United States actually has declared openly that it does want Ukraine to win. It's more a question of whether that reflects reality. I'm not sure that U.S. policymakers are truly committed to that, but openly they have said that. So they've said the right things. It's now a question of whether they'll do it.
Thanks a lot. I think we must not agitate ourselves. Then all of us here are firmly convinced that we must do everything that Ukraine will win the war. And we, my colleagues, and a lot of other German friends, we are constantly engaged in the public debate and constantly pressuring our government to not to stick at this pattern, too little, too slow, go forward, more determined. So this is not what we have to discuss between each other. I think we have to be very clear about the arguments which are used against going full in support of Ukraine, and not this kind of step-by-step, tranche by tranche. It's a matter of time. Time matters in war. And we have already lost a lot of time. Also, when it comes to main battle tanks, Western fabricated. You mentioned the ammunition issue. You need to build up capacities. This takes time. So when you say you don't buy the escalation argument, of course, we constantly argue that if we are afraid of escalation, we leave Putin the dominance of escalation. We give him free hand to escalate the war. But you have to take it serious. If you ask why the German government is hesitating, you have to take serious the argument, and Olaf Scholz is constantly repeating it, that his first goal is to avoid a spillover of the war into a NATO-Russia confrontation. And you have to confront this argument. So let's not preach to the converted. Let's look for the kind of arguments we need to convince our public and to convince our governments to be more determined and so. And one of the arguments, of course, is the international or in the global dimension of this war. This is about the future world order. Can we defend a value-based liberal international order, or will we fall back into kind of Darwinistic global situation? Can we defend international law? And of course, then we have to stick to international law ourselves in our actions. Or will we fall back in the law of the jungle? So I think we have to raise all kinds of arguments, yeah, to make clear that this war is not only about solidarity with Ukraine, it's about us and the future of Europe and the future of the international order. So.
I would like to support, of course, that it's a war that is taking impact on the whole Europe and the world. And actually, of course, as Ukrainians, we understand that all their international attention is in Ukraine right now, and there is a great support. But we also understand that there is certain hesitance and certain maybe tiredness of their all the countries that taking part in supporting us, and it's a very dangerous situation when we are taking delays. We're taking this time to think about, okay, we gave so much weapons, and then we have to negotiate what we have to do next, and all the delays that the Western world is taking right now. Of course, it's used by the Russian Federation, and this is a big threat to Ukraine. And we already have shown Ukrainians that we are able to not only resist, but we are regaining our territory. We are able to restore our territory and the order on this territory, and we are able to gain our territory back. And our president made firm statements that we don't consider annexation and taking all the territory that Russians have been taking as their fact, and we are fighting till will never accept that these territories will be Russian, and people who live on these territories and they won't accept it. So of course we never would think that we were feeling, and like Professor Gryzak was telling today, that in his article that he was showing that maybe this plan was even made before in 2008. So, but we were really maybe we're not articulating, but ordinary people were already feeling the threat in 2013, 2014. We were like feeling that it's coming. It was hard to kind of, you understand, but you can't accept it. And it's finally came. So it's hard to accept that it's already, we are almost 1 year in the war. Of course, I would like it, nobody was thinking that Ukrainians, and I hear it a lot, would resist so good, so long, and so proud. And I think that right now it's not the time for, of course, should be diplomatic decisions. It's not only military campaign, it's also the informational decisions. It's we have to take their legal steps to build up their base for the prosecutions. We should fight not only in their battlefields, but also in the European Court of Human Rights, International Court of Justice, like our country is filing the cases. So it's also very important, in my opinion, like a lawyer. And this is the time of action and the time for unite of all there, and Europe especially.
Can I just interject? In terms of making it clear what the war is about, and that it's about more than just Ukraine, it's about Europe, of liberal democracy and our values. What about this? That we've been talking quite a lot about the collection of evidence and the documentation of all of these crimes. What sort of role can that play? Because this is something that is really quite new, this incredible mass of evidence, and the ability to get this out to people everywhere in the world immediately. It's something that was completely absent in the Second World War, for example, where people really didn't know, could not understand what was going on. Now people can really see what this war actually is, how Russia is conducting it, and the sorts of atrocities that come out of it. Is this a way to keep up this kind of public support of the war and to kind of make it clear that this is not just some territorial conflict in some faraway place, but a new threat that could affect all of us?
Of course, documenting the war crimes, and as it was was said in the previous session today, the storytelling is very important nowadays. And today we can witness that social media. We can see everything in social media. In one way, it makes us closer, but in another way, it's also makes that people are getting used to violence, and there are people who are telling the stories, who are documenting these crimes, should put the emphasis that it's not something that is banal in our life, that is something that we have to get used to, that these crimes are really of the grave character, and there are evidence that we have several projects that are working right now and are engaged in collecting this evidence. As we witnessed, there is such projects in the Pilecki-Institut, which is associated with the work of their Raphael Lemkin Center, and also such projects as a Reckoning Project, which is conducted in the University of Michigan, which is also a combination of the work of their journalists, their lawyers, and also preserving their memories of the atrocities and the victims, giving them the voice, giving them their ability to be heard. And the other thing that the project is about is to making these memories and making some memorial of their crimes that were taking place in Ukraine. Maybe it will be symbolic, and what way it will be represented is still being negotiated, but it's important that before their judicial proceedings will take place, because they always will take certain amount of time, and we don't know in what form they will be represented. But the victims need to have their voices heard right now for all the other nations to know about what is happening in Ukraine.
I also, I mean, it's an excellent point you raised, John, about that to sustain Western support, particularly the major government support, German support among others, is that it has to show there is a real contrast between the two sides. One side commits systematic atrocities, the other side imperfectly so far. I hope it will become better, but does comply with the norms that are expected. I should add, there are Western countries that have failed to live up to these norms as well. And I regret that they aren't punished more. They have been on occasion in the United States and Britain, for example, but not enough. And in fact, the previous US president pardoned a couple of the worst breaches of those, Edward Collins in particular, who was a psychotic murderer, and Trump pardoned him and gave him a medal. So it's important for Western countries to live up to the standards that they expect and want to hold Russia accountable for breaching so systematically. But to the extent that Ukraine can document the scale of the atrocities, the brutality of Russia's war, then that will certainly help, and I think is extremely important of the efforts of NGOs, but to do it in a way that makes clear that Ukrainians also will try to abide by those standards.
Can I introduce a broader theme here? Because I think once in a few generations, we have to remind ourselves that you cannot appease dictators. You have to stand up to dictators. And I think that has been missed over the past 10 or 20 years. We all thought after the Cold War that peace and love had broken out, it was all going to be fine. And we've exactly. And I think particularly in Britain and Germany that there are factions in our political discourse who will do anything to appease and to avoid conflict. Now, avoiding conflict is not a bad thing, but you don't avoid conflict by appeasing a dictator. And in 2024, I'm editing a book called The Dictators. And I thought that was just a simple title. It says what it is. It's 60 essays on 60 different dictators throughout world history. But of course, the publishers, I don't know what it's like in other countries, but in Britain now, you can't do anything which isn't politically correct. So but it sounds as if you might be glorifying dictators. I said, why does it sound like that? Well, we think you should have a subtitle called Lessons from History. And well, fair enough. But the sensitivities on these things are incredible. And I mean, you go back into just very recent history. I mean, would this be happening if Obama had actually stood up and actually not crossed his red line in 2013 in Syria and also in 2014 over Crimea, where the Western response was pathetic, as it was in 2008 in Georgia? So Putin obviously got encouragement, I mean, it seems to me, from those things. Would this have happened had he taken a different role? And I think Obama and Merkel, who we in liberal Europe, we tend to think of as sort of slightly heroic figures. I think history is going to judge them very, very differently.
Very quickly just add on that is going back even further to 1992 and 1993 when Western governments did nothing about Russia's intervention in South Ossetia and then Abkhazia, and then that same year, 1992, in Moldova, subsequently in Tajikistan. I mean, there's this long history in which Russia has just been able to act with complete impunity in the former Soviet Union, as though those countries aren't real countries. So that's I think that the very phenomenon you mentioned, goes back that long record up through 2014.
Perhaps at this point I should open the floor to questions from the audience.
Imagine that we suddenly had a social media link to, I don't know, somewhere like Irkutsk, and there was a young teenager who had been kidnapped by Putin. What do we say? Who'd be listening to all of this? Are we saying we're coming to get you as fast as possible? What I would ask the panel, particularly the American, the German, the British representatives, what do we say to that child? But on the other hand, I would also say, and this goes to Iain's point, and I entirely agree with it, but let's not forget the bomb, because the implication is, and I hope the NATO planners have done their work, that we should be prepared for a preemptive conventional strike against the Russian nuclear infrastructure. And my analysis is, I think they've probably been a major focus of the United States for at least the last 10 years, but no one wants to talk about it in public. I'll happily come and talk in other places about it. But if you're talking about standing up, then you have to face that down. You have to face down, what are you going to do about the bomb? Are you prepared to have a war with Russia? Yes, I was guilty. I didn't think Putin was stupid enough because I thought the Russian army was crap, and I thought that 200,000 into 40 million doesn't go. But he believed his own advisors and thought he could get away with it. Sorry, I was wrong. But if you're going to mess with these people and not appease, then you have to be prepared to take on the issue of the bomb. And that may mean that you have to be prepared to have a conventional strategic strike against the Russian nuclear infrastructure. And maybe that's what you say to that teenager. But all those kidnapped kids, what are we saying to them? And I'm sorry, Boris Johnson's running around, hooray, we sent 14 tanks. Nonsense. We should be sending hundreds. And NATO outspends Russia.
We've only got
20 to
200.
1. 20 to 1. And we argue about a few tanks here and there.
Question of clarification. When you talked about a kidnapped kid, do you mean the Ukrainians who have been taken to?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So
I'm not sure if I got your comment right acoustically, but I would urgently warn against talking about military strike, conventional strike against Russian nuclear capacities, not only in terms of feasibility, with 10,000s of nuclear warheads in Russia, submarines and land-based, but this would immediately ruin public support for than Ukraine. If you are playing with the fear of a nuclear war in Europe, this is self-defeating. I think the answer to any kind of nuclear threat has to be deterrence, firm deterrence. And we have, I think, quite an interesting example when the Russians, Putin himself and Lavrov and the other cronies started to play with the nuclear threat in summer. There had been a very clear response from Washington, but also from other NATO countries. Don't do that. Don't use nukes. This would, and this was the language, this would have catastrophic consequences for Russia. They didn't say which, but they made clear that then the US would step in. So, and this has to be the language to the Russian leadership. But of course, this requests the willingness, the political willingness in the West to set red lines. And the use of nukes could not be the only red line. The Russians are now doing with conventional weapons what they threatened to do with nuclear weapons, to destroy the civil infrastructure of Ukraine and to destroy the very fundamentals of livelihoods of tens of millions of people in Ukraine. This is a war of destruction. So I think it's, and this is what I would advocate for, that Western countries, and they have to be a united position, have to send a clear message to Putin: stop this, otherwise it will have severe consequences for you. We don't have to say which ones, but I think there had be a credible, and this is part of a deterrence policy, a credible deterrence not to go on with this kind of war of destruction against the Ukrainian infrastructure.
Yeah, just very quickly on the nuclear issue is, I have no doubt at all that the U.S. government, going back for quite a while, but particularly over the last year, has in fact prepared for exactly what you were raising, Dan. That is a massive conventional attack on Russia's nuclear facilities. It's very wise not to talk about it publicly. I think for all the reasons that Ralf just mentioned, I think it would be this is one issue on which I would give the Biden administration credit, that it has dealt very skillfully, I think, on the nuclear issue. When Putin first met in early March, or at the end of January of 2022, with his Gerasimov and I think with Shoigu, and ordered them to put Russian strategic forces on higher alert. Russian strategic forces are always maintained on high alert. They have been. They were from the 1960s on. Soviet strategic forces and then Russian. So he was, that was mostly rhetorical at that point. And the Biden administration, I think, quite wisely ignored it, even though they paid close attention to what had been said. So I think, even though I have not been uniformly approving of the way the administration has approached this war, I think on this issue they've actually handled it very well. I don't think that Russia's going to be able to get away with will gain anything from a nuclear strike, and I think that's been made very clear to them, which is one of the reasons that Putin hasn't engaged in it yet.
More questions?
Thank you very much for the panel. I have a very short comment and a question. One of the panelists mentioned that I agree that I think Zelensky's team did a very good job in terms of showing the image of Ukraine, but I think it's at this place it's not necessary to mention that some of them are female and majority female politicians are going out to do this job. I think the mention of gender here is really not necessary. And so my question is, so it's since 1 year, it's 1 year since the Russian aggression against the Ukraine, and what do you think is the biggest change in your respective countries and also in Europe? Thank you.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, in Ukraine, which I'll comment on as an outsider, but as someone who spent a great deal of time in Ukraine over the last 25 years, is, and here I would differ some, I think, with Yaroslav Hrysak, who tended to argue that Ukrainian national identity was already very strong by the time of the 2014 and the current war. So there was certainly Ukrainian national identity. However, it's not surprising that war would have congealed that. That's a theme going back to Charles Tilly and others who looked at war and state building. War is often conducive to nation building and state building. Throughout European history, it has been. So it's not at all surprising to me that this war has congealed Ukrainian national identity in a way that perhaps no other thing could have. Also, I should add, the removal of Crimea from Ukraine, temporarily at least, has actually strengthened Ukraine because it removed 2 million people, roughly, who had voted for pro-Russian candidates. Now, that perhaps is not something that you want to continue, but it, at least in the short term, has helped the solidification of Ukrainian national identity. The role of women, I think, in the current war, though, going back to gender, is, I think, extremely impressive, and I hope that that will result in a greater presence of women throughout Ukrainian politics in the future. I hope that they will press for that. So it's opened a lot of opportunities in a tragic way, but that perhaps in the future will be positive.
Good.
Just a few statements. I think that the war changed a lot of. This is very big change in European and world politics. And first of all, it reflects that Polish warnings against Russia was right. Because we warnings Europe about the Russia, about regime in Russia. I would like to remind you that before the attack against Ukraine, in Russia at least, Putin killed, his regime killed 158 journalists. And this is the question of passivity and passivity of the reaction of the Western countries. Because Putin calculated that the West is weak, that the West is divided, and the attack against Ukraine will not bring anything negative for him. It turned out that is not true. It's very important that Western country mobilize, but we should do more. And if you ask me what changed this war in European politics, and first of all, I think that the idea of sovereignty of Europe is not possible. The war shows that we need Anglo-Saxon countries, we need United States of America, that we need to protect Europe against the regimes, against the dictators, and against the very aggressive politics of Russia. So this is the very, very deep changes in European policy. All of we wish to end the war as quickly as it's possible. I'm very afraid that it's not possible now, as we observe now the war. So we should prepare ourselves and our countries and leaders of different political parties that some very important problems in Europe will stay with us, that it's not possible to come back to the previous situation before the aggression. But I think that it's very positive that Ukraine definitely chose to join to the Western civilization, to the Western countries that want to be a member of European, of EU, that now we are talking about even Ukraine in NATO. So this is very, very positive shift. And I think that this is one of misunderstanding that I want to explain. And when I talked with the German diplomats, they told me that now, and this is like 5 minutes for Poland, that Poland went through the golden period. This is completely misunderstanding, because most of my compatriots in Poland went through horrible times. We really observed Putin 24th of February. We expected them, and it was the tragedy always, also for us. The mass help of Poles came through our experience, because we remember. We know what Poland went through for hundreds of years in the confrontation with the aggressive policy of Russia. And I think, and I appreciate the role of Greens among German policy and politics. I think that is very important role, because some kind of criticism came from Greens in relation to Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, and the deep collaboration with Russia. So maybe some kind of change also also will be possible in the German policy. And Chancellor Scholz also joined to the, those politicians and those leaders who very roughly defend Ukraine, the right to be sovereign state, and to build our good future in Europe.
Okay.
Although,
Maybe
to say something positive about Germany, in spite of all this German bashing. Now, if 1 year ago you would have predicted that within a year Germany will cut off oil and gas supply from Russia, will deliver machine guns, howitzers, anti-tank weapons, infantry armored vehicles, and now even Leopard to Ukraine. People would have said, are you crazy? In which world are you living? So of course, and you know, we had been criticizing the German attitude also before 24th of February towards Russia. We have one of the most outspoken critics of Nord Stream 2 and non-delivery of weapons to Ukraine, all this stuff. But if you, for a moment, reflect the German mindset before 24th of February last year, and what has changed, you should recognize it. We can criticize that it's too little and too slow, but for Germany it was enormous. It was really enormous. And instead of with the German bashing, we should try to convince our political and economic elites that we should not stop half-hearted in this, what Chancellor Scholz said, a change of tides or a turn of times. Yeah, that we have to go further, not only in stepping up our military capacities. You know, the Bundeswehr really has been plundered over the last 15 years to the bones, but also in our clarity that there is no return to any kind of normality with Russia as long as the Putin regime is in power, and that we have to support Ukraine full-heartedly, because it is also about our interests and about the future of democratic and united Europe, which is at stake.
Thanks. Maybe I should take a few more questions. I'll take them. Oh, yes, of course, Iain.
Just as, okay, against the charge of being a sexist pig, basically. I think it's wholly relevant to mention the fact that the MPs generally coming to Britain were youngish and female, because at that time, the government was trying to persuade British people to take in Ukrainian refugees into their homes. So rather than send out some 60-year-old bald sort of male MP to do that, they decided, presumably the Ukrainian government decided rather than the British government, that they would send out their most sort of televisual, attractive people to do that. And I think it worked very well. So I think it was entirely legitimate.
I also want maybe to make just a small comment about women representation also on this conference, because among my colleagues from Ukraine, I can see most of them are women, because a lot of the men are in Ukraine, they are fighting, so it's understanding of this situation for me as well. And I also would like to support the idea of what was changed, of course, the consolidation of the Ukrainian nation, but the other thing that has dramatically changed, that we lost the illusion. We lost the illusion that it's possible to live when we are being there have been aggression taking place very slowly. I would wish that our country would acknowledge it a little bit earlier, like that it's already a part of their large-scale invasion when it started in 2014, and we were losing this illusion very slowly, in my opinion, and I wish we would start to act earlier than this. So in my understanding, this is also right now, everything is clear, and we lost all this illusion that it's possible to live without not counteracting actively with their aggressive state that just borders you.
Okay. So let me take questions from a couple of people before we answer.
Thank you for the discussion. I would like to mention, as an editor on the book of West Planning, that it is not enough to bash the West. It is also necessary to have a critical view on what Eastern and Central Europe did wrong in the last few years. It's also important to emphasize that we are now saying that, oh, there is no solidarity. There is also the chances when the countries from our region could show their solidarity. For instance, with refugee crisis 2015 of Syria. There were also Putin's victims. There were also victims of Wagner groups. Same with financial crisis in Greece. Same with, with this agenda of, illiberal turn and seeking like political alliances among the far right politicians who were on the Kremlin's payroll. That was also visible in East and Central Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Balkan countries. It cannot be denied, and it did such a huge damage to the Ukrainian and to the Russia-critical agenda in the West. I think it should be stated here. It should be also an object of further consideration and consider how to proceed further. Thank you.
There were some questions here.
Yes, thank you, Daria Melling-Lipmot. So my question concerns the crime of incitement to genocide. So the first part of the question is whether we can treat Russian propaganda as an incitement to genocide. And the second is, concerns that and related to that, whether the people who are responsible for that, whether in your opinion they can be persecuted for their crimes as soon as it will be possible after Ukraine wins the war and so on. And the second in relation to that is whether we here in the West also should treat it this way and should talk about it more, because sometimes I have an impression that society in Germany or in other Western countries, they just do not know what is talked about in Russian media and how this the agenda that is pushed through Russian media, how it can be a part of incitement to genocide. And whether if we focus on that, if you think it is necessary to focus on that, whether we can ensure more support, both politically, but also in society, because I don't have an answer to that, so that's why it would be interesting to hear it from you. Thank you.
And I wanted to touch upon briefly upon disagreement between Ralf and Magdalena. I think it's important. And I think when we say something, we use some wording or make some assumptions, we should think about political implications of this. And I think Ralf assumes that if he says that we should assume that Ukraine might not win the war, he thinks he encourages more resolute Western position, more support to Ukraine. That's my understanding. Whereas Magdalena thinks when we raise this assumption that Ukraine might lose, we disencourage support. So I think we should really talk about what would be the right wording. I personally, as a Ukrainian, more tend to agree that we should not raise this assumption, because if my house is on fire, I just do my best to save it. Yeah, so I don't have even thought I might lose or I might not succeed, you know. But I think it's important to think about wording and implications, political implications of wording, yeah.
So we have some internal arguments. We have it all the time, and that's good. I would say at least we should be clear also and open in our language that this war is not decided. The outcome of the war is not decided. And that it very much depends from the efforts of the West. You know, the willingness of Ukraine to fight, the moral of Ukraine, and this unbelievable, I would say, also the readiness to sacrifice. This is without doubt. But without ongoing support from the West, Ukraine cannot win. And this is the purpose of the argument, yeah? To raise the willingness and the determination in the West for continuous military, financial, political, humanitarian support of Ukraine. That it is about us, our responsibility, that Ukraine can win this war. And regarding the question of Daria, I mentioned it already in the opening session with Mark Kramer. Yes, and this is why we did this international conference end of October on genocide in Ukraine. We have to take serious, and we should make it more, I would say, visible in our public, that we have to take serious this language which is used in Russian propaganda, that de-Ukrainization, denazification, the hate against all these Ukrainians who refuse to recognize themselves as Russians or to accept that they are Russians. That this is an inherent tendency to genocide. It's an inherent tendency to genocide. And especially for Germany, this is a very important recognition or a very important message, because Germany drew, I would say, two major conclusions from its own horrible past. The Nazi past: never again war of aggression and never again genocide. So we have to remind our people that there is a responsibility to prevent genocide in Ukraine.
I would fully endorse what Ralf has just said. I would add that the very people you refer to, like Pyotr Karpov, Vyacheslav Nikonov, Peter Stein, all of them. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so the very people you mentioned, the propagandists who are publishing in TASS or Novosti or other official publications, not just online, but in official publications, ought to be held accountable, put on banned lists, forbidden ever to travel to the West unless they want to be arrested. So ultimately they're going to have to be held accountable within Russia, but that's going to take a change of political system to do. Let me add just two very quick final points. Is that Putin yesterday, on the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad, went to Volgograd, which is the former Stalingrad, and made a very angry speech. I would recommend watching the speech, in which he tried to draw a parallel between that battle, which was it was the turning point in the Second World War. It made very clear that Germany from then on was fighting at a great disadvantage because it had to reconfigure all its forces, and And also, Germany lost significant numbers of troops. The Soviet army lost larger numbers. It lost well over 1 million soldiers in that battle. Putin, in referring to it, was very consciously trying to say, yes, we have been set back now, but just as before we rallied and came back and ultimately defeated the Germans, that is what we're going to do here. So I agree with Ralf. We have to be mindful that this isn't over, or even close to being over, that it's going to require a long haul here. And then the very final point on the question the important question that Ralf raised about, that has come up over and over at this conference, about the desirability of setting up a tribunal. And again, we debated what form it should take. This again is a question, in the case of former Yugoslavia, as Nadia Bojagieva discussed in her presentation yesterday, that laid this out very well. That tribunal was set up in 1993, so it was before the worst atrocities that occurred in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it was certainly while all the leaders were still in power. Now, for 7 years, it appeared that they might never be held accountable, but ultimately, Milosevic was arrested in 2001 and put on trial, even though the trial had to be halted when he died. So I don't rule out that eventually the leaders of Russia will be held accountable as well. And therefore, even though it is a signal of a breach with the current Russian government, I don't see any way of working with the current Russian government, so I'm willing to take that risk.
I just have a very short comment on their incitement for genocide. In their convention, genocide convention, there is equal obligation, positive obligation of the state to undertake action to prevent and to punish genocide. Unfortunately, genocide is usually viewed as something that has, when everything has already happened, the atrocities has happened, and there is no really a precedent for prosecuting for incitement of genocide, but it might be. Yes, but Rwanda, yes, the only yes, there was the only one in Rwanda. But I'm thinking that yes, was just want to say stress that it's equally a positive obligation of their states to also to prevent, because we are not talking about prevention about genocide. And in the case of Ukraine, it can be also a precedent, the second precedent.
I think just Professor Hrycak wants to make a short comment, if we can allow.
If I may.
Please.
I just want to respond to the brief comments made by Professor Mark. The child comment on that, but I don't want to be misunderstood. I never claimed there was strong identity, Ukrainian identity before the war. What I claimed that Ukraine met minimal requirement to be regarded as a nation, so to say. And this, I believe, is very much important. I just don't buy argument that this is the war that created a nation, or that kind of this argument, so to say. What war did, really, it's reshaped the shape of the nation, also made this consolidation effect. But this is something I believe that doesn't disqualify. There was no nation, or there was no identity, Ukrainian identity before the war. Thank you so much.
Very quickly, I fully agree with you. In December of 2021, I published an article making exactly that argument, that there was actually a strong Ukrainian identity that congealed going back even into the 19th century, certainly with from Taras Shevchenko on. And so it was a question of building an effective state along with that national identity. And that's where I think there had been quite a bit of, of behavior that didn't reflect the seriousness of the situation.
Can you please speak directly to the microphone?
Just a very brief response to the final question there. If we try and censor the debate and not mention the possibility of Ukraine losing, that is just propaganda. And it plays into the hands, I think, of Putin there, because we become effectively the same as sort of TASS or all the propagandists in Moscow. You have to deal with the reality that you're facing.
As I said, it was the 3 wonderful days of our conference. Thank you very much, all participants, all panelists, all guests who came to us to visit us and to listening the conference. And it's the best proof that we are talking and discussed about extremely important issue. And I hope that we will continue our meetings. But now I would like to say thank the 2 group of Pilecki-Institut employees. Thanks to them, the conference took place. It was the wonderful cooperation between Berlin branch and the Warsaw Center. And especially I would like to say thank you to Dominika Uczkiewicz. Dominika, show you. John Cornell, Agnieszka Konik, Ala Nowobilska, Jurek Rochoziński, Mateusz Werner oraz and chief of the scholars group, Krystian Wiciarz. The key figure. I also add Bartek Kapica, where you are. Okay. Thank you, thank you. I would like to express my gratitude to all group, Polish-Ukrainian group, consisting of Lemkin Center with his chief, Jakub Kiersikowski. Jakub, where you are. Thank you very much for your work, and thank you all the members of Lemkin Center, and especially Kateryna Leontieva, Dmytro Anopow, Hanna Berchowa, Julia Mizukina, Ostap i Malinka Junko, Sierhij Truszkin, Zofia Mańkowska, Adrin Golosko. I would like to thank you. I would like to say also I'm very grateful to Karol Kalinowski and Paweł Ablamski from our section of archive, and also Barbara Konarska, Ewelina Stemplewska, Karolina Niezgocka, who took care about the press information. So thank you very much. And the next time we can meet or in Berlin or in Warsaw. Let's see. But I think that it was wonderful 3 days full of discussion, and it was a great pleasure to take part in it. Thank you very much.